Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing some important international questions with a major U.S. security analyst. Our guest on the Bugajski hot seat is Stephen Flanagan, senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation in Washington, D.C. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Russia's Defeats. An integral part of Russia's state propaganda is to create an aura of invincibility in its foreign policy. But reality is less sanguine, as the Kremlin's covert war against the West is experiencing an escalating number of defeats that weaken its expansionist ambitions. Moscow relishes reports about its role in undermining Western states by corrupting politicians, championing populists, and propagating informational havoc. Such achievements propel the perception that Russia remains a great power and must be treated as an equal by Washington. But the Kremlin hides failures that expose its incompetence. Hence, an important weapon in the Western arsenal is to loudly trumpet Moscow's defeats. The most notable Kremlin failures have included the coup fiasco plotted by Russian intelligence officers in Montenegro and its inability to keep Montenegro out of NATO, ineffectual intimidation of the Baltic states and Poland from reinforcing NATO's military capabilities, and impotence in preventing Ukraine from petitioning for NATO membership. However, the most monumental Putin debacle has been the impending loss of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, the Universal Patriarch of Orthodox Christianity, is preparing to rule in favor of the Ukrainian Church gaining independence from Russia's Orthodox Church, whose patriarch collaborates with the Kremlin. Moscow will not only lose an important tool of influence in Ukraine, it will also forfeit a fundamental yet fraudulent claim to dominate the Eastern Slavic world. Ukraine's history and identity predate that of Russia. Ukraine's church is older than Russia's, tracing its origins back to the 9th century Kievan Rus. Its heritage has been appropriated by Moscow through generations of disinformation imposed through the imperial expansion of the Grand Duchy of Moscow since the 15th century. Patriarch Bartholomew has now reaffirmed that Ukraine was never a legitimate part of Moscow's canonical territory. The revived Ukrainian Orthodox Church will help consolidate the country's statehood, identity, and integrity. Additional Kremlin defeats are also looming on the horizon and should be widely publicized to demonstrate that Russia's rollback is gaining momentum. The Belarusian Orthodox Church is likely to be next in line for autocephaly, and Macedonia is poised to join NATO following its recent referendum, if indeed the political decisions are subsequently made. Growing realization that Russia is suffering serial defeats on the international arena, coupled with the grinding decline in living standards, is more likely to turn citizens against the Putin regime than any promises of freedom and democracy. Putin himself may well be remembered in history as the Moscow ruler who presided over the final collapse of the Russian Empire. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with my special guest, Stephen Flanagan. Steve Flanagan is the senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation here in Washington. In addition to being my former colleague at CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Steve has served in various senior government positions, including a special assistant to the President and Senior Director for Defense Policy and Strategy at the National Security Council. And as I said, now he's at the RAND Corporation. Thank you for joining me, Steve.
Nice to be with you, Janusz.
Maybe you can start with telling our viewers a little bit about the RAND Corporation, its history, its mission, its impact on U.S. policy, and so forth.
Surely. Well, RAND Corporation was founded back in the dawn of the Cold War in 1947, 48. It was founded to support the U.S. government in the development of some of the concepts, particularly beginning with the Air Force and concepts of deterrence and how to deal with the emerging challenges of the early post-Cold War period. So many of the eminent theorists it's often associated with many of the eminent theorists of nuclear strategy, Tom Schelling, Bernard Brodie, others that over the years had come into prominence in thinking about deterrence theory, but it's evolved into a much more diverse organization over the last several decades, where it is now a multifunctional research organization. It is called, it is actually a series of what's called federally funded research and development centers. It has a special privileged relationship with the government, not just the federal government, but other government agencies and state governments, where it does sponsored research for government clients. Heavily on emphasis on data and methodology and balanced and objective analysis to support broader policy analysis. So it works both with a number of sponsors in the defense sector, but also in a lot of work in healthcare, in education, and other aspects of social policy. So it's a much more diverse organization now, and it's gone international. It has offices around the world, in addition to Santa Monica headquarters, Washington here, in Pittsburgh. We have offices in Cambridge, England, and in Canberra in Australia, and in Brussels.
Oh, in Brussels as well. And you basically publish a lot. You hold conferences and symposia and so forth.
Yes, well, we do a fair amount. Not as many conferences as some other think tanks. That's not. I mean, our focus is on providing analytics support to the sponsors, and which we can also, by the way, include foundations, foundation-sponsored research. We don't do quite as much in the area of public outreach. More when we're presenting the findings of different studies, but we don't do a lot of convening. We do certainly welcome a number of visitors when they're here in Washington from, particularly in my area, in the defense and political science area, that people who are working on defense and foreign policy or officials that are coming to Washington, we do welcome them for roundtables, but generally not big public events.
A lot of good analysts that I know for many years work at RAND, so it's very well respected here in Washington.
Thank you.
Let's start. I know your work of late is focused primarily on the Black Sea region, Black Sea security. So let's begin with probably the key country in the region that you look at, which is Turkey, a country that straddles several unsettled neighborhoods, to put it mildly, including Balkans and Caucasus and Middle East and so forth. Let me ask you a few questions about Turkey. We've heard in recent years that Turkey is pursuing this neo-Ottoman policy in its former dominions in the Middle East and Balkans and so on. What does this mean in practice? How do you see this policy?
Yeah, this has been an interesting debate, especially within the Turkish studies community. Was it really neo-Ottoman? Is it an Islamist internationalist kind of policy? I think my bottom line conclusion is that Turkey is really pursuing a very nationalist policy right now, particularly in the aftermath of the elections earlier this year, when although President Erdogan does not he needs a coalition with and has formed an informal coalition with the Nationalist Party, the MHP, in the Grand National Assembly, but it's more the policies that, if you look at the policies that he's been pursuing, it's very much driven by an underlying nationalism and a protection of Turkish interests. And I think you can explain a lot of the behavior that he's been pursuing in the context of a growing nationalism. The effort is to sort of put Turkish interests first. It is, in a sense, it's very much sort of an echo a bit of the America First policy. You can say Turkey's interests first. His appeal to the nationalist elements within Turkey as a way to ensure the solidification of his base. And I think you see, as he's been very pragmatic and flexible in certain cases, willing to work with the Russians, perhaps out of necessity in Syria, willing to work with the Iranians as well, but yet holding a deep suspicion of both those countries and recognizing that its interests don't converge with either of those two countries, either in Syria or elsewhere in the broader region.
Right.
With Europe, of course, it's had a mixed relationship. Erdogan, of course, last week was in Berlin trying to sort of patch things up a bit, not very successfully, but nonetheless a recognition that he really needs European support in the context of the emerging financial crisis in Turkey, and so he needed to get things back on a better footing with them, particularly because of the exposure of a number of European banks to the debt that is now looming as a bigger problem in Turkish debt repayment.
But the Turkish political system is, I suppose you could no longer characterize it as secular nationalism, Ataturkism, if you like. It's more Islamist.
It is.
Could you explain that to our viewers in Kosovo in particular?
No, I agree. I think there is still this appeal to the notion that Turkey, first of all, of course, that Erdogan has achieved many of his goals that he said he wanted to allow for the development of a more pious society, and many people thought that, well, maybe this really is an Islamist neo-Ottomanism, and then this notion of building bridges and special relationships with many of the countries that were formerly part of the Ottoman Empire. But I think Turkey's ambitions are even more global, and certainly, it has been active in the Balkans. It's been active in trying to rekindle, and certainly active in relations with Iraq and of course in Syria, in trying to reach out even before the Libyan civil war and even with Egypt. But frankly, its policy that AKP, the Justice and Development Party, articulated when it first came to office in the early 2000s, this notion of zero problems. It now has problems with almost all of its neighbors, so it's a real challenge. Nonetheless, Turkey's ambitions remain quite grand, and developing, of course, establishing military bases in the Gulf, in Qatar, the continued efforts to play a bigger role even in Africa, both in trade and in aspects of security. So there is a broader Turkish nationalist view of the idea that it's one of the G20 countries, and it should be recognized as a leading force in international affairs. The interest that they have also in establishing and deepening relations with China, being one of the western ends of the Silk Road, of the One Belt One Road. So I think there's a lot of it's hard to it's easy to characterize it one way or the other, but I think that the general assessment, and not just me, but a number of other Turkish analysts of Turkey that I talk to, feel that the Ottoman label is kind of a bit too simplistic, and well, there are elements of that. There are elements of this broader Islamist reach. Ultimately, it comes down to this strong protection of Turkish national interests, and really driven by those core values.
I know in my region, particularly in the Balkans, as well as in parts of the South Caucasus, Turkey has become more and more involved, particularly economically, but also culturally and in the religious realm. Does it try, do you think, to offer an alternative model of development in terms of its political and economic system?
Well, that certainly was the way in the aftermath of 9/11 and in the early 2000s. Both the Bush and the Clinton administration, both the Bush and the Obama administration looked to Turkey as a contrary example of how you could have Islam and development and integration into the global economy, that it wasn't a question of either or, as some of the Islamist extremists were suggesting, that you couldn't be a good Muslim and be, that the global economic system was stacked against the Muslim world, and that you had to upend it, and create the new Ummah in order to really achieve your aspirations as a nation. Turkey was a great counterpoint to that. Now, the Turks, I remember in those days, when we were still at CSIS together, were very hesitant about this. I wasn't so much talking in official channels, but the Turks were very hesitant about this. They didn't want to be seen as an example, or certainly to be held up as a model per se,
Right.
but nonetheless they were, and they had enormous reach. And just even the way their television programs and other aspects of culture were very much of appeal in the broader Middle East and into the Gulf. Turkish soap operas were heavily in, and where women were seen as in positions of power and having, whether they were covered or not, that they were out there making their way in the wider world. It had a powerful influence, and I think that many. And I remember also being in Gaziantep before the terrible civil war developed there, where you see a lot of Syrians coming to Gaziantep in Turkey, thinking that, oh well, this is like being in the West. We've come to Europe. This is so Turkey is a bridge to Europe within the. And so I think that that model, and I think it still has some appeal, out there, but obviously it's been tarnished by some of the developments internally in Turkey, and of course all the turmoil there.
Turkish-EU relations. Could you sort of give us a synopsis of where things stand now? I know they've steadily deteriorated, particularly recently between Ankara and Berlin. But could you give us a sort of overview of where they stand, EU-Turkish relations? Well,
there's been, certainly since over the last 4 or 5 years, it's been heavily focused on the migration issue and driven by that, and the question of the various efforts that the EU has tried to put out there to encourage Turkey to continue to deal with the migrant issue more effectively, to help it resettle, to accept and resettle, over 3 million, of course, refugees, mainly from Syria in southern Turkey. The various elements of the EU strategy have been to offer additional assistance, both in terms of migration and other aspects of development, with the promise that down the road there would be some revisit of the customs union and opening of visa-free travel, which is really what the Turks most want out of that relationship now. With the migration issue settling down a bit, I mean that the flow has diminished, and Turkey has done, I think, quite a commendable job overall in treating those refugees that are on its and displaced persons that are on its territory. From all reports, I've not been to any of the camps, but from all reports that I've seen, they are seen as having done quite a good job, and while it did become a bit of an issue this year in the Turkish political, in the election, both the parliamentary and presidential elections, there was no big call. It was just the sense that it was time for some of these people to be resettled, which of course explains some of Turkish policy in northern Syria. The EU has clearly, I think there's no illusions on either side. The notion that yes, we want to keep the accession discussions going. I think that I remember some Turks sometimes joke with you and say, well, we pretend to be interested in becoming members, and the EU pretends to be interested in having us join. That sort of adage. But I think it's more than that. There is still, obviously, Europe is Turkey's largest trading partner. It's an important source of investment and two-way trade. The Turks do recognize that over the long term, despite the talks about doubling or tripling their trade with Russia, building a new economic sphere in looking to their south and east, that's really been quite a challenge, that they haven't had much luck in finding access to those markets and developing alternatives. So the EU relationship, I think, remains very important to Turkey, but of course the EU can't look aside at some of the developments internally within Turkey and the annual reports that the EU Commission does, faulting Turkey for its repression of human rights and of media freedom, the continued repression in the wake, and of course the sense that many of the actions that were taken in the aftermath of the coup are now being institutionalized through new laws. Well, the state of emergency has been formally lifted. That there is, in fact, many of the same practices that were of concern to the EU and other countries are still in place. So it remains a very tense and quite volatile relationship, as I said at the opening, that we saw even with Erdogan's visit to Berlin, which was certainly Merkel seemed to be doing all she could to try to help put this back on a better footing after despite the things that Erdogan said about referring to the Germans as Nazis and other kinds of things during the election campaign early in the year. Yeah. Well, you mentioned
Let's put it this way, I cannot see, and any Europeans I talk to cannot see Turkey ever being a member of the European Union. Some are quite adamant about it, I know, not so much the Germans, but the French and so forth. Do you see any prospect?
No, I don't. I don't really. I think that some kind of a close association. There were various ideas that were floated in the a deepening level of integration, but sort of on the edges of, but not something short of full membership. I think that there's still a sense within. First of all, of course, there's the sense of limits of the EU process right now, and the internal turmoil. But even back in the period of 2009-10. There was some sense that there ought to be some kind of alternative sort of associate membership, or some kind of both Sarkozy and others had floated ideas about, and even Merkel had floated ideas of some kind of halfway house that would be heavy security and economic integration, but without full political integration. And I think obviously Turkey's so big, it'd be very hard for the EU to digest right now. But that doesn't mean I don't think that kind of a relationship would be. I think Turks should not necessarily view that as a failure. I think that would reflect, in some ways, a recognition of their importance, but without perhaps the full political integration. And frankly, at this point, certainly Erdogan is not interested in trying to uphold the European acquis if he started to be, challenge himself in the European Court of Human Rights and other things about what's going on in Turkey. So, that said, I do think that the other thing reason why I favor the continuation of the EU discussion is because I do think it holds hope. If you look at the two leading opposition parties, both in the leading candidates, Mr. Isik Mrs. Aksenar, who ran against, in the two leading candidates that had the most votes total against Erdogan. Both of their parties, the so-called E party, Mrs. Aksenar and the CHP, ran on policies of restoring relations with the EU and NATO, getting those back on a better track. So that I think is an important reminder of why the EU process remains important, to give reformers and those who are inclined towards more democratic values a sense that there are standards that we need to uphold to be more integrated into the wider European community.
Sure. In the meantime, U.S.-Turkish relations appear to have deteriorated under our administration, Trump administration. Yes. What are the main reasons for that? Is it this non-extradition of this Muslim cleric Gulen, who I know has residence in Pennsylvania, I believe? Yeah. Is it the detention of this Christian missionary in Turkey? I mean, presumably there's something much deeper involved here. Could you tell us?
There's been tensions building up. Largely, I think it really goes back to U.S. policy in Syria, where the Turks are very much opposed to what they feel was a bait and switch that was presented by the Obama administration, and then continuing now under the Trump administration to some degree, that the support for the Kurdish militias, the so-called YPG, who they see as very much linked in a subordinate element of the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, which has been waging this insurgency in Turkey for over 4 decades, that they are very much disappointed that there wasn't a move away, particularly at the beginning of the Trump administration, when they began to talk about further cementing that relationship as the battle against ISIS was completed, and helping to train the YPG militias to be a border force. That really set the Turks off in the sense that somehow you were going to put a group that they saw as supporting the insurgency within Turkey in charge of their southern border.
Helping the separatists.
But there have been, helping the separatists. So there has been, I think, some real progress in the last few months on that score, where there was the so-called Manbij roadmap that Secretary Tillerson started to develop, and then was finally concluded over the summer with Secretary Pompeo and Minister Çavuşoğlu. There do seem to be some progress in terms of U.S. and Turkish joint patrols in Manbij as a way to ensure that what the U.S. had evidently, government had, I was not serving in government at the time, but there was a commitment that there would be efforts to resettle the Arab populations that had been driven out of there, and that it wouldn't be, that the region wouldn't be turned over to governance under the YPG or its political arm, the PYD. So that I think is still the fundamental tension that's out there, in the sense that certainly the Gulen problem, the sense that the U.S. was slow to both come to, although I think the Turks are mistaken, because if you look at the record, in fact, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, was out in Turkey within 2 weeks. There was a strong statement of condemnation of the coup. Vice President Biden then made a trip out there. So, and then there's certainly been efforts since then to make it clear that despite the concerns about what Erdogan was doing internally, even before the coup, that the U.S. did condemn and oppose the coup. Nonetheless, there is a feeling, and I think many Turks realize that that we don't necessarily believe that they have provided concrete evidence. Evidently, the Justice Department has been presented with their portfolio about Gulen and how Gulen masterminded the coup. For what I have no access to that information or talked to anyone who's reviewing it, but evidently it hasn't been conclusive enough to allow the Justice Department to inform the State Department that indeed his extradition is warranted under the terms of the various treaty arrangements that we have, the extradition treaty that we evidently have with the Republic of Turkey. But the Turks then say, well, we understand that President Trump can't just wave a wand and or make a directive and say, turn Gulen over, but their feeling is, well, why aren't we putting more pressure on Gulen? Why are we allowing him to live a relative life of luxury up in northeastern Pennsylvania? Why is there no effort to clamp down on some of the schools? Well, of course, that you can get into another civics lessons with the Turks about. That's not necessarily how the U.S. judicial system works. We don't go after our political enemies generally.
They've actually done this in the Balkans by extraditing forcefully.
And putting pressure, and then putting pressure on a number of countries in Central Asia, too, where they put pressure on extraditing Gulenis and some of the military also who had sought asylum after the coup. So I think it is a deeper, the immediate pretext is the sense that certainly because the policy has become so personalized, President Erdogan's first visit here, when he thought he could convince, in the summer of 17, when he thought he could convince President Trump to sort of cease and desist the support for the YPG militias and perhaps turn over Gulen, whether he was certainly saying that publicly, whether, the notice that once the two great leaders got together, they could sort this out. Well, of course, he came away quite disappointed, and he had that nasty incident with his security detail beating up people near the embassy there in Sheridan Circle. So that was a bad episode. And then, of course, the sense that this effort with the YPG continued thereafter. Trump felt that whatever from all reports, President Trump felt that they had a deal that he would make some efforts to help convince the Israelis to release a Turkish citizen who was being held in Israel, and also make some other gestures that I don't know what the full scope of it was, and that in turn that Pastor Brunson, the missionary who lives in Izmir, who had been under house arrest, had been in jail, would be released completely. And of course, the Turks took a halfway and offered him, retained him in the country, but under house arrest rather than incarcerated in prison. Trump, I think, apparently felt that was a bit of a betrayal, and then of course. Then also, at that time, there was all of the pressure on imposing tariffs on various imports, particularly steel, Turkish steel, which is a fairly significant element of the U.S.-Turkish two-way trade. So all of that contributed, I think, and added to the sense that you now have a kind of a high-stakes gambit where both leaders feel that their personal honor and pride is at stake, and so I think it's going to be difficult for either to back down. But I think that what needs to happen is to maybe offer Erdogan some kind of face-saving gesture where he can release Brunson without there being some major gesture with regard to Gulen, because I just don't see that happening.
Would you say, and sort of stepping back from the specifics, would you say that Turkey is a reliable NATO ally? We've had this case recently of blocking the F-35, Senate blocked F-35, sale of F-35 fighter jets to Turkey. Ankara has said they'll retaliate in some way. I hear rumors that they may constrain their role in NATO, not allow American basing. Do you see that as a danger?
I think it's out there all the time that there is this danger. I would say Turkey, my characterization would be Turkey remains a sometimes difficult ally, but on the other hand, if you look at the record, what has happened, yes, they wouldn't allow, for example, about a year and a half ago, German members of parliament to visit forces that were deployed there because of the political rift that was then ongoing with the Germans over the migration deal and other things. Because of the way also that the Germans were limiting AKP's campaigning in Germany during the referendum at that time, the referendum on the constitutional changes back in 16 and 17. I'm sorry, and then. But I do think if you look at the overall record, the Turks have continued to offer the U.S. and the coalition access to Incirlik Air Base. There's also NATO aircraft operating out of their Konya Air Base. There's other aspects of they continue to allow the deployment of the one of the radars that's part of the European Phased Adaptive Approach and missile defense. All of those, and finally did join the coalition against ISIS after much cajoling by the United States. All of those suggest that indeed Turkey can be sometimes difficult in sort of getting inside and on track within overall NATO policy or in supporting U.S. efforts. But in the end of the day, I do think that the Turks recognize that their security commitments under NATO and that their relationship with the U.S. is the most reliable security relationship that they have. And going back to the sense that as much as Erdogan may be more nationalist, more willing to push Turkish national interests first, on the other hand, he's also shown a certain pragmatism. And so even in the aftermath of the coup, many were fearing that perhaps there would be a shutdown of U.S. access to Incirlik, or that perhaps they would curtail those operations or restrict other aspects of U.S. military operations there. But and of course, as the continuing differences over the support for the YPG militias evolved, but that hasn't happened. And so I think it'll remain a situation where I think we will see it difficult with the Turks from time to time. They haven't been completely, well, they were calling in the run-up to the Warsaw Summit for increased NATO attention to the Black Sea. On the other hand, they also have not been anxious to see an expanded NATO military presence in the Black Sea, because they. I
was going to come to that in a moment, actually. Sure. Okay. Let me sort of step by step to that. Talk about the Turkey-Russia relationships. As you know, they've been rivals for centuries in the Balkans, in the Black Sea, in the Caucasus. Where do things stand now? What is your assessment? It's sort of hot and cold. Sometimes after the shooting of the Russian plane a couple of years ago, things deteriorated very rapidly, and then the relations were restored to a higher level. Energy dependence increasingly from Russian side. How do you characterize that relationship now?
I would say that it's they're managing their differences. They have. Clearly, there had been, they know that, the Turks know ever since the Russians moved in 2015 into Syria, that Russia was going to be one of the key powers in sorting out their interests in the stabilization of northern Syria and the securing of their border. So in some ways they had no choice but to move forward. You then, of course, had the shoot down at about that time in late 15, which caused this crisis. But as was evident, that again, because the Turks recognized the fundamental geostrategic reality that Russia was going to be the key power on the ground in putting pressure on Assad and trying to sort out some of the security situation in northern Syria, that they were going to have to work with the Russians and to ultimately join in the Astana process. So there was this effort despite the sanctions and the curtailment of tourism and trade. Finally, Erdogan, achieved, close to, or offered, was close to an apology and a restoration of relations and getting them back on track. And there was a certain bond. I mean, Putin himself talked about, whether he really felt this so personally, but claiming that after the shoot down, he felt he had been stabbed in the back by an old friend. But he also, suggested an old friend who, by the way, had been supporting terrorists in the region. So it was a very. It's been there's been this sense that the two of them have a sort of a mutual admiration society as strong leaders of their countries and trying to play some of the same political games in terms of moving from one position to another as prime minister and president. Nonetheless, I think there's an abiding wariness of the Russians. For a long time, the Turks thought that they also could manage the relationship with the Russians in the Black Sea, but as the military balance has begun to shift, particularly with the seizure of Crimea and the Russian moves into creating this, all of these improvements in the defense of Crimea and the wider Black Sea, their ability with these long-range strike systems to be able to threaten Turkish and other NATO militaries at some distance from Crimea, the buildup in the southern military district. All of this has, I think, gives the Turks some pause about where Russia's headed and how this military power might be used in detriment to their interest. And the Russians have, you know, at various points made some very threatening comments to the Turks about reminding them, you know, who is the greater military power in the region, and how they expect the Turks to be cooperative with regard to maintaining security in the Black Sea region.
Very good points. And with regard to NATO's strategy in the Black Sea region, NATO is constrained because of the Montreux Treaty about how many vessels and for how long it can place in. And in addition, of course, both Turkey and Bulgaria have been hesitant in pursuing and supporting the creation of some kind of Black Sea fleet, which really leaves Romania as one, as our outpost, if you like, the most committed outpost along the Black Sea. How do you see this? Would you, you've mentioned the fact that Russia has, let's say, regained a lot of literal control, Crimea, Donbass, Abkhazia, retained a lot of literal control over the Black Sea. They built up the A2AD bubble in Crimea itself. They built up their forces, their fleet, and so on. How do you see that developing? In other words, what will be NATO's role? How constrained will NATO's role be in the future?
Well, I think NATO is still, it was recognition even at the Warsaw Summit that when it created a tailored forward presence for the Black Sea region, the Framework Romania headquarters, and an increased maritime level of activity, it was recognized that there had not been enough. I think many NATO officials of NATO governments and NATO international staff would tell you that there was a recognition that they hadn't paid enough attention to the Black Sea region, and that Russian strategy in the region was of increasing concern. And as I said, you know, even Erdogan was complaining that NATO needed to pay more attention. You're absolutely right. There's no consensus, you know, particularly among our three allies in the region over how, or the three littoral states that are allies in the region, how they would, you know, how we should proceed in defending our interests, Western interests and NATO's interest in the region. That said, I think despite the hesitancy that the Bulgarians and the Turks have sometimes shown, there has been a continued participation in various exercises that have been underway. Sea Breeze and others that are regularly held in the Black Sea region. The Bulgarians, in terms of the bilateral relationship with the United States in the defense area, the Bulgarians have continued to welcome Marine training and Army training in the Novosela facility in Romania, as you say, that there's been sort of open arms welcoming both at MK and in Constanza the activities of the U.S. military, and continuing to develop that relationship. Of course, the opening of the other radar sites in Devaselu, all of that, I think, suggesting that there are steps, step by step, there is a recognition that NATO needs to do more, that we can work together within, you know, some limits. As you say, Montreux creates some interesting challenges in terms of the naval presence. That said, the U.S. has continued certainly to deploy destroyers regularly to the region. There have been increased operational tempo, I think, of some of the other NATO standing maritime fleet and other. Admiral Fogo, the Navyur commander down in Naples, has been very outspoken, or not outspoken, maybe outspoken is too long, but certainly has drawn attention to the region and continued to talk about the need for NATO to focus more effort in that area. So I think it's a step-by-step process, again, because of the fact that there isn't complete consensus among the three key allies in the region as to how to go. And of course, NATO is balancing, you know, the whole, this 360 notion of strategy, how much of a balance to put in sort of the growing concern about the North Atlantic and the enduring concerns about the Baltic region. What about the southern dimension, the whole question of dealing with terrorism and other threats from from a more global basis. So balancing all of those in the context of still limited growing but still limited resources.
Right. We haven't even mentioned the ongoing war with Ukraine,
Yes.
Russia-Ukrainian war,
Right.
And the potential threat. I mean, let's put this not just the Black Sea, but Russia seems to have closed off as much as it can the Sea of Azov to Ukrainian
Yes.
shipping to the port of Mariupol. There's a danger that they could try and expand their territorial control, but also the control of the Ukrainian coast.
Yes.
How would you characterize the NATO-Ukrainian relationship? There have been some promises made, including at the Bucharest summit and more recently that Ukraine will eventually become a member. In the meantime, are we giving Ukraine sufficient support to defend itself against further Russian aggression?
Well, NATO as a whole has been a little bit cautious, although a number of NATO allies have supported the U.S. efforts that have been underway since really end of 2014 into 2015 of the efforts that have been undertaken to train and equip first the Ukrainian National Guard forces and then some of the Special Forces Unit and the regular army. There was, of course, there was a deep U.S.-Ukraine and NATO-Ukraine relationship going back to the early days of the Partnership for Peace. The U.S. had helped the Ukrainians do quite a bit to help upgrade their fleet, modernize it with some communications and other things. That training relationship continues, and I think that there has been a lot achieved. Of course, this administration made the decision also to provide Ukraine with the Javelin anti-tank weapon to be able to at least deal with if there were another Russian push or Russian push against Mariupol or somewhere else along the coast, that there would be some additional capacity to. There's also been efforts to improve the Ukrainian military's warning of impending attack, some of the defensive measures and radars and other things that the U.S. has provided. So all of that, I think, has helped at least to affirm that there is a willingness to provide Ukraine with increased capacity to defend itself, and that a number of NATO allies, the Canadians and the Brits at least, there may be others that have been involved in some of those training programs. But there's been hesitancy, and of course the U.S. provision of the Javelin was controversial. I know that at least during the Obama administration, a number of the European allies very much opposed that move, and I don't know whether there was much objection when President Trump decided to go ahead with that.
As you know, the Ukrainian Parliament has ended this non-bloc status, and the government has ended non-bloc status for Ukraine. And support now for NATO membership is growing for the first time really since independence. Nothing focuses the attention more than being attacked by a neighbor, I suppose. But do you think Ukraine could get a membership action plan over the next few years, much as the Balkan states did in the past?
I don't know. I tend to doubt it right now, just given where NATO is and where until there. I mean, if there was some progress on the settlement in Ukraine, I could see allies coming together on that. But in the context of if it were to be seen as something that the Russians would seize upon as a reason for rekindling some of and widening the still smoldering conflict that goes on in the Donbas region, I think that would be. I could see that being difficult. But that's just a guess. I really haven't been involved in any of those discussions. With
you must also follow the whole NATO enlargement question.
Yes.
Montenegro, most recent member, was great success for both Montenegro and for the region, I think.
Yes.
Macedonia seems to be stuck. As we know, the referendum didn't meet expectations, even though the yes vote was high, the total vote was low. Possibility of snap elections if there is no parliamentary two-thirds majority for constitutional change. If Macedonia, well, give us two alternatives. If Macedonia is invited and enters NATO, what will that mean for NATO? And if it doesn't, in other words, if it fails and it doesn't change its name, Greece continues to block and there's no immediate future for entry, what will that mean for NATO?
Well, the whole goal of, I feel, having been involved early in the U.S. relationship with Macedonia, going back to as early as the 1990-91 when I was serving in the Bush 41 administration, I feel very badly that despite all the heroic things that the Macedonian government has done to support U.S. efforts and NATO efforts in the Balkans and stabilization and dealing with the Kosovo problem all these many years, that they have been left in this situation. And I think, like many people, saw great hope when they finally reached agreement with President Tsipras Prime Minister Tsipras to sort this name issue out. I think that it would be unfortunate for the broader goal that NATO had undertaken when it moved toward expansions into Southeastern Europe, beginning with Romania, then to Slovenia, then Romania, Bulgaria means Slovenia, and then of course now Montenegro. That this notion that you could show the countries of the Western Balkans that there was continued hope for further integration into all aspects of the Euro-Atlantic sphere of both the economic and political and the security sphere, and that this was part of a ever-widening Europe, and that promise that by pursuing the appropriate relations with your neighbors, settling regional disputes, moving to implement some of the principles that NATO said were essential to becoming a good member of NATO in good standing, that those all would be somewhat undermined. So I think that would be a real loss for that aspect of NATO strategy. I don't think it means all hope is lost. It doesn't mean that this could be not resolved down the road, but it does seem like this is the best chance that Macedonia has to continue along this path. If it is left out, I think it perhaps will raise continuing cynicism within and among a number of the other countries in the region about whether NATO is really committed to this, or whether there's some other hidden agenda, or somehow that there's really a wavering of this effort. And it was good that I think that the Montenegro decision went ahead as planned, and it showed that NATO wasn't, despite all the other distractions and the focus on and the various mischief that Russia reportedly undertook both there and elsewhere in the West Balkans, that NATO stuck by its resolve and went ahead with the decision to invite Montenegro.
Right. Well, hopefully Macedonia will have the same treatment, and once they get through this political, let's say, stalemate at the moment. But we'll see. In the future, of course, there's other countries that do want to get in, including at least a part of Bosnia, but also Kosovo. Do you see a prospect for Kosovo becoming a NATO member anytime soon?
I think I really don't know. I haven't looked at that. I mean, certainly there's been a tremendous commitment to support of NATO and welcoming NATO's presence, and of course I think a lot we would all depend on whether the Allies agreed that, if you look back to the principles of enlargement established back in 1995, if Kosovo was at that stage where it had seemed to resolve some of its lingering disputes with Serbia, with its efforts to deal with some of the other internal reforms, other questions that would be on the agenda. I think certainly the door should certainly remain open, whether or not the Allies would be when that would happen. But I do think it would require certainly having continuing to have some kind of a stabilization presence on your territory would be a non-starter. But down the road, if there were continued progress in dealing with the regional disputes and a peaceful settlement and a new set of relationships with all of its neighbors, certainly that should be in the offing.
Last couple of questions, Steve. We're beginning to run out of time on U.S. policy towards the region. Well, U.S. policy towards NATO, let's put it that way. As you know, Donald Trump himself during the campaign wasn't speaking very highly about NATO. In fact, at times he suggested it was obsolete. This changed quite, if not verbally, at least in practice, the policy has not backed that up. In other words, I think our commitment to NATO is as strong as it has ever been, probably. I mean, the enhanced forward presence in the Baltics and Poland has been enhanced. As you mentioned, javelins have been sold to Ukraine. We're probably more committed to Georgia. How do you see the Trump policy towards NATO developing now? Is it all about 2%, or is there more to this?
I think there's more to it. There was, of course, a lot of confusion in the first year of the administration, both the comments about NATO being obsolete and the seeming sense that somehow that we could find a new modus vivendi, that the U.S. could find a new modus vivendi with Russia, that it was absurd that somehow we were in conflict with Russia, and that Putin in particular was a man that we could deal with. That certainly sent a lot of confusion throughout the alliance and concerns, and even second countries thinking about did they need sort of a plan B in case somehow that there was, particularly I think in Central and Eastern Europe, but what if there was this great reconciliation, and would Trump waver? Was there a grand bargain in the offering? Of course, all that has been set aside, I think, as you say. And I think we're in a much better place. Clearly, as we're oftentimes admonished on the outside, don't look at the tweets, look at the policy. And as you say, all of those steps that have been taken are very positive. I think the focus on 2% is a bit mistaken. It's an important indicator, and I don't think there should be. Certainly, the last several administrations have all said that there, and you remember that Secretary Gates and others, President Obama was also sort of criticized for being heavy on that issue. It is a measure of input, but what more important is what is the output. And I think looking at some of the measures that what the Europeans have committed to in this so-called the 430s initiative at the Brussels summit, the other aspects of modernization of their own forces, particularly some of the larger ones, the Germans and others that have clearly allowed some of their forces to hollow out. It's important that we see, I think, real progress there. And I think if that becomes more the focus, that it's a good thing. And I think that if President Trump has helped nudge this along with his sort of sense that, well, if you don't pay your dues, we're going to think of alternative approaches. If that's helped, that may be good. But I think in the end of the day, the most important thing is to maintain alliance solidarity. And thus far, at least, I think we have seen that both in continuing the sanctions against Russia with regard to Ukraine and also maintaining a resolve about continuing with the enhanced forward presence and, as you say, even improving it with some additional funding that came through under the European Deterrence Initiative. Right.
Maybe last question. As you know, the Trump administration, particularly Trump himself, is favored, and he said this at the United Nations, sovereignty over, or let's say patriotism over globalism, I think the way he put it. And he did support Brexit. He supported a looser European Union, if not the breakup of the European Union. How does that affect our relations with Europe? And does it overflow into NATO? Because after all, most of NATO is the European Union.
Yeah, no, I think that remains a troubling element of the administration's policy right now. The notion that is the administration, by its actions and statements about America first and U.S. national interest predominating a world of nation states, and suggesting that some of the global institutions of which we were fundamentally a part of in developing in the the Bretton Woods system, other things, that is causing real anxiety among a number of European allies. In a sense, I think it is very much contributing to that sense of Plan B sort of thinking within a number of European countries, in the economic and the political sphere, as well as and even to some extent, although I think that's diminished a bit in the security sphere, where there was some talk about a Franco German sort of amping up of the European security and defense capabilities as an alternative if the U.S. decided, well, it was going to turn its back on NATO. I think that's diminished, but there is, I think, still a lingering concern about the challenging of the aspects of the elements of the United Nations institutions. Certainly, all of that, I think, causes the Europeans great concern. And of course, the way it also can bleed into NATO is because the fact that NATO, in Article 2, articulates a number of principles that its members should be upholding and promoting, and they stress, they stress transatlantic cooperation on a whole range of political and economic issues. And if we're pursuing more nationalist policies in each of those spheres, it can begin to chip away at the sense that, well, aren't we in NATO as a collective where we share not only common interests, but many common values and goals in the political and economic sphere that we're trying to promote and advance. And indeed, that was one of the fundamental tenets of the further enlargement that began after 1999, that we were expanding these values and institutions that we would hope that other countries that had fallen behind the communist bloc would be able to embrace.
Well, it's interesting because in previous administrations, as you said, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've linked the two together. Enlargement of NATO is important for the EU. EU enlargement is important for NATO. Some in the administration, at least those around Trump, seem to be, let's say, unlinking the two. You can have a good commitment, strong commitment to NATO without having a strong commitment to the EU. How do you see this?
Well, I think it fundamentally it's a fundamental challenge to the transatlantic relationship, because whether we like it or not, these European governments have decided to form an ever closer union. Mm-hmm. It has been certainly imperfect. It's as you say, subject to the challenges that Brexit and developments in various member states that are presenting the EU with. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, I think it remains an important element of promoting broader stability in Europe, mm-hmm. And that it remains an important element of the transatlantic relationship that we should try not to interfere in too much. That we certainly want to make clear the U.S. concerns about EU policies and trade and other aspects of social policy, mm-hmm. but the notion that we should be trying to actively undermine efforts of the European Union to continue its process of integration, I think is very dangerous to the broader transatlantic relationship.
On that note, Steve, thank you very much. Okay. I enjoyed it very much seeing you again after all this time. Thank you for joining me on the show.
Thanks, pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Mira Pavshim.